Today we're again studying the thought of Ibn Rushd or Averroes, and this is the second day of the 3 days of study we're going to devote to the thought of Averroes. Today we're going to focus on language and dialectical reasoning, and also his Aristotelian philosophy in that connection. The work that we're looking at first is the Tahafut or Incoherence of the Incoherence. This is his detailed response to the Incoherence of the Philosophers written by Al-Ghazali. You'll recall that when we looked at that work by Al-Ghazali, we went through in detail the discussion of act and agency and the discussion of will as well. We're going to look at Averroes' comments on that and his reaction to it on behalf of the philosophers. In that, he's not going to agree with all the philosophers. He certainly doesn't agree with Avicenna in all things, but he's going to do a great deal to defend, in his own words and with his own reasoning, the approach that the philosophers take, and to defend it against the dialectical critique of Al-Ghazali. We're also going to see something of his method here again, as we did last week. Let's proceed. So last class we focused on the Fussel Maqal. You know that work, as I mentioned, is called quite frequently the Decisive Treatise, but I gave it a different title. My title was The Book of the Distinction of Discourse and the Establishment of the Relation of Religious Law and Philosophy. So my view is that, in fact, in that book, different kinds of discourse are distinguished, and after that distinguishing of the different kinds of discourse, recall the kinds of discourse were rhetorical, dialectical, and demonstrative or philosophical discourse. So on the basis of that, in addition to that division of the discourse, he also treated of the relation of philosophy and religion, and of course he gave a rationalist account whereby the demonstrative truths attained by philosophy are given primacy over religion. The reason for that, of course, as you'll recall, is that there is but one truth. Truth does not contradict itself, but bears witness to itself in every way. As he said, quoting, without mention, quoting Aristotle in the Prior Analytics, Book 1, Chapter 32. So there we saw quite a bit of Averroes' method in proceeding, and we saw his dialectical reasoning in theological matters. So my understanding of the treatise that we looked at last week is that it is, properly speaking, a dialectical religious treatise. Nevertheless, underneath that, and at the foundations of it, in a hidden way, is a philosophical treatise arguing for the primacy of Aristotelian philosophical reasoning and principles, basically syllogistic reasoning as the foundation for the understanding of all reality. In the mind of Averroes, then, these two go together very well, because dialectical reasoning is appropriate in religious matters, and perhaps also, to some extent, in urging the masses to act in the right way with rhetoric as well, but both have to be grounded in philosophical reasoning as an ultimate foundation, even if the people of the dialectical group and the people of the rhetorical group do not fully understand. And that's because of the primacy of truth. So I've set out here for you on the slide two principles that I think are quite appropriate here. The first I call the Methodological Principle. And that is, as you see on the slide, the meanings of language in reasoning must correspond with the understandings that participants in the discussion are able to achieve. Participants must seek to understand only in accord with their abilities. So there are two things there. We have to address people in a way that they can understand, and the people themselves are obliged not to exceed their own abilities in these matters. And then I added to that the truth principle. The truth value of those meanings is not tied to the mode of understanding, nor to the ability of the hearer, but rather to the objective truth on the issue. So as far as Averroes is concerned, there is an objective truth, and truth can be attained through philosophy primarily, and science, of course. That's regarded as part of philosophy, theoretical reasoning, that is. But the expression of that truth may be made in different ways. So some people may think that things that are put forward in a dialectical way, making use of metaphor and simile, some people may think that those should be taken literally. And they may be incorrect in that matter, because philosophy may show that in fact these are not to be taken literally, but rather to be taken in a figurative fashion. So the methodological principle and the truth principle work together in this. But the truth principle remains primary here, and through that truth principle there is a guarantee that there is no conflict or no absolute contradiction between the truth of religion or dialectical reasoning and the truth of philosophy. Let me say something about the dialectical character of the incoherence of the incoherence. And let me say it through Averroes himself, because he's very clear on this. It's a bit buried in the middle of the book, but he's prompted to respond to questions and issues relating to what a demonstration is and how it fits in and who can do a demonstration. And it very nicely indicates the dialectical character of this work. Now remember, when I say dialectical character, I want to stress the notion that certain things are taken as a foundation for the reasoning and are not established with a demonstration at the very foundations. So dialectical reasoning in this case will be a kind of religious kind of reasoning. So many religious assumptions are being made here, but as we'll see, Averroes changes the meanings of these in accordance with the nature of the hearers. So his own argumentation will be founded on the philosophical foundations and meanings of terms, but the presentation and the basic notions that are to be adopted here will also be expressed in religious terms. So I give you the text here, and we'll go through this in some detail. This is from the Tahafut Critical Edition by Maurice Bouygues, and the English translation we have is by Simon Vandenberg. I'll use the abbreviation then of TT for this, or Tahafut. I quote, Averroes says, "All this is the theory of the philosophers on this problem, and in the way we have stated it here, with its proofs, it is a persuasive, not a demonstrative statement. That is, it's a dialectical account. It is for you to inquire about these questions in the places where they are treated in the books of demonstration, if you are one of the people of perfect happiness, and if you are one of those who learn the arts the function of which is proof." Let me pause there for a moment. So if you are a person who is able to use the arts of reasoning and proof, and you are thereby a person able to make use of the books of demonstration, which would be Aristotle's logical arguments and also other works of Aristotle where demonstration is used. So he's indicating here his commentaries on the works of Aristotle. And he also indicates that if you are one of the people of perfect happiness, what is this notion of perfect happiness here? It comes from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 7, where Aristotle says that the greatest amount of happiness that people can have is if they participate in the kind of happiness and activity that takes place in God all the time. There he identifies this with contemplation or theoretical reasoning at the highest level. And that theoretical reasoning will be based on philosophical accounts and demonstration to the extent possible. Human beings are able to do this for short periods of time, says Aristotle, and of course then human beings have to take a break and rest and have food and nourishment, etc., to be able to carry this on. So what we have for short periods, God has all the time, and that's what we should seek after. Those people who do this attain the fullness of happiness, according to Aristotle. And that's what Averroes is referring to here. People who don't have that intellectual ability to rise to the level of demonstration then have a different kind of happiness, a happiness perhaps based on good moral conduct and proper action, but nevertheless not the same kind of happiness as the philosophers have who grasp the truth directly and fully, making full use of their intellectual abilities. So the philosophers have to be people of good moral disposition and also people of intellectual ability, high intellectual excellence or virtue as well. So he's making a distinct reference to this in this case. We carry on then. I quote him again. For the demonstrative arts are very much like the practical. For just as a man who is not a craftsman cannot perform the function of craftsmanship, in the same way it is not possible for him who has not learned the arts of demonstration to perform the function of demonstration, which is demonstration itself. Indeed, this is still more necessary for this art than any other. And this is not generally acknowledged in the case of this practice only because it is a mere act. And therefore, such a demonstration can proceed only from one who has learned the art. Let me explain his point here because it's very important. So, just as a craftsman must function as a craftsman, and not anyone who can imitate the craftsman in a superficial way is necessarily a craftsman, so too in this case then, even if the student can imitate the words of the professor, unless the student knows what a demonstration is and knows that the premises are true and has correct argument form, then only that way can the student have a demonstration for him or herself. But the person who has learned the arts of demonstration is able to carry out the demonstration. Those who just imitate the words or just parrot the words of the instructor who lays out a demonstration does not have knowledge for himself because he doesn't know the premises for himself and understand the argument form for himself. And when he throws in this little note about, and this is not generally acknowledged in the case of this practice only because it is a mere act, what he's referring to here is that people don't generally acknowledge this notion of demonstration, and that demonstration itself gives knowledge. And the person demonstrating must know for him or herself the premises in the argument form. And it seems that it's a very simple matter that anyone can do. So if a professor can put a demonstration on the board, then the student can also put something on the board. But it doesn't mean that the student fully understands the premises and the way the argument functions. And to have a demonstration, one has to know exactly what one is doing and not just parrot someone else. Let me continue then with the quotation. The kinds of statements, however, are many, some demonstrative, others not. And since non-demonstrative statements can be adduced without knowledge of the art, it was thought that this might also be the case with demonstrative statements. But this is a great error. So, we have to have full knowledge and understanding of what we're doing in this art of demonstration. He goes on. And therefore, in the spheres of the demonstrative arts, no other statement is possible but a technical statement which only the student of this art can bring, just as is the case with the art of geometry. So, while others can imitate the geometer, rather the geometer has to know the premises in the argumentation and that lead to the conclusion in the reasoning of geometry. Well, so too then, one has to be technically competent in demonstration in order to fully grasp the knowledge that demonstration yields. That is, to have it as knowledge from oneself, because the very putting together of the demonstration and the reaching of the conclusion is thinking that leads to truth, if the premises are true and if the argument form is valid, because that's what a demonstration is. So the grasping of the entire demonstration is the very gaining of knowledge here. And it's a technical matter, so just as the geometer has technical training and has to work in technical ways, so too the practitioner or student of this art has to act in the same way in the demonstrative arts. Last section of the quotation then. Nothing therefore of what we have said in this book is a technical demonstrative proof. They are all non-technical statements, some of them having greater persuasion than others. And it is in this spirit that we have written here must be understood. That what we have written here must be understood. I slightly modified this translation by Bouygues. So, this very clear statement has to be kept in mind while reading materials from the Tahafut Tahafut, and using those materials and the Tahafut itself to interpret the meaning of Averroes. So, this is not a demonstrative work. He does not claim to have proven all of the foundations. So what I suggest in reading this is that we take these words seriously. Where the arguments that he gives in the text can stand on their own philosophically, then we can count those as philosophical arguments. Where they can't fully stand by themselves, then we have to realize that those arguments are only dialectical in character. And the place where we find then the fullest accounts of the demonstrative arguments will be in the Aristotelian commentaries and other strictly Aristotelian philosophical works by Averroes. So we have the third discussion to look at today in detail, and it concerns the dissimulation or deception, if you like, on the part of the philosophers regarding the notion of God as agent and maker of the world. Again, these are the same issues that we looked at with regard to Al-Ghazali. Today I want to look at these three issues. For the most part, though, we'll cover just the first two, and I'll provide a few comments on the third one if there's sufficient time. The first view, then, is from the viewpoint of agent, and that's going to concern the issues of will and choice. That's this first lecture for today. The second lecture will carry on with this notion of act, and then perhaps also get into that other work I mentioned, mentioned on the syllabus. That is the work of theology by Averroes called the Kashf al-Manahij, or explanation of the sorts of argumentation used in religious arguments. The third is the viewpoint from the relation of act and agent, and that is on the issue of from one only one can proceed. I talked about that in my second lecture on Al-Ghazali, and of course we also talked about that with regard to Avicenna as well in the lectures on Avicenna. That you'll recall that second lecture on Al-Ghazali we did not present in class because the first one went so long. But the second I urge you to have a look at, so that's Al-Ghazali B, I think it's 5B in the lectures, but it's the second lecture on Al-Ghazali, and you'll need to look at that outside of class if you've not already looked at it. So let's proceed. Al-Ghazali's assertion that agent conceptually entails willing, choosing, and knowing what is willed is not self-evident and so must be reasoned, writes Averroes. So Averroes here initially then divides agents into two sorts, a natural agent and a voluntary agent. We've seen this kind of division before in Al-Ghazali's discussion, and that discussion was for the most part based on his understanding of Avicenna, and in some cases also Al-Farabi. A natural agent, it's specified in the text here, the natural agent has one essential act. So the essential act of fire is to burn. That act follows immediately upon the essence of what it is, what fire is. And that's a natural agent. So the natural activity of a plant is to grow, and it's essential to the plant that it grow. And it take in nutrition, etc. Voluntary agents, on the other hand, their activities vary considerably with regard to their context, because voluntary agents are deliberative, and they have knowledge in the acts that they carry out. So the definition of a voluntary agent is one that is deliberative and knowing. So a human being must deliberate and know what one's doing and assess a certain context and then determine how one acts. And that action is voluntary. Averroes, however, points out that God is neither of these. His action is neither natural nor voluntary. Why? Well, he gives several reasons, but among the easiest to understand are these. Natural action does not proceed by knowledge. The natural action of the plant to grow does not require that the plant have knowledge. The natural action of a fire to burn does not require that the fire have knowledge. And second, so it's not the same as God in that case, because God's action requires knowledge, because of the nature of what God is, an immaterial entity. We'll get into that very shortly. We'll get into that in more depth. And second, choice is for what is better. So when we choose between A and B, we choose for what is better. What appears better to us is the object of our choice. So we don't choose what is worse, we choose what is better. But in the case of God, there is no need for any kind of betterment, so there's no reason to attribute any choice to God, because God does not have a choice between A and B, where B is perhaps better than A, and then God chooses to do one over the other. Rather, God does what is good and right. And we saw that in Avicenna as well, that God pursues the good. And the good itself is the reason why God emanates all things. God's under the notion of the good. God pours forth all goodnesses on creation. But in this case, neither of these notions belong to God. So notice the sort of thing that Averroes is doing. He's setting up what he will do throughout the work, and that is he will refuse to allow that many of the key categories that we use in our language and our discussion here of things in the world and in things of our experience, he refuses that those apply or have the same meaning when applied to God. So when we attribute various things to God and various characterizations, the meanings of our words are different from what they are here. And at Tahafut 149, or page 88, 88 is the translation, 149 is the Arabic. He writes the following, which is very important, and notice what I put in bold on this slide. Quote, "The way in which God becomes an agent and a willer has not become clear in this place, since there is no counterpart to his will in the empirical world." That's what I was just saying. So the conception of will attributed to God is not the same as the conception of will that we have in our experience in the world. He goes on, "How is it therefore possible to assert that an agent can only be understood as acting through deliberation and choice?" You see his point then. If will is not the same thing, and yet the definition of will involves deliberation and choice, and yet God does not deliberate and choose, because God does not weigh the alternatives as to whether to do what is good or what is less good, then how does it apply? These don't seem to apply at all. He goes on then, "For then, this definition is indifferently applied to the empirical and the divine." By Al-Ghazali, that's what he's referring to here. But the philosophers do not acknowledge this extension of the definition. That is, philosophers refuse to say anthropomorphically that the human conception of will is precisely the conception we should attribute to God himself. He goes on, "So that from their refusal, the philosophers' refusal, to acknowledge this definition as applying to the first agent, it cannot be inferred that they deny that he acts at all." All right, so the argumentation was, close quotation, so the argumentation was for Al-Farabi that anything that acts must act by will, but will involves deliberation and choice. We negate deliberation and choice of God, therefore we negate the conception of will, the human conception of will of God, and say that there is another conception. But Al-Ghazali had said the notion of will that involves deliberation and choice, including such things as the possibility of not creating the world, perhaps. Al-Ghazali said these belong to God, but in this case we say that the notions of will among human beings in the world and notions of will of God are equivocal. They are not the same things. The word is the same, but the meaning of the word is not the same. And so here, since God does not have deliberation and choice, here Averroes says, well, then God does also not have will. In the same sense, the same anthropomorphic sense that Al-Ghazali insists upon, because everything that acts must act by will, according to Al-Ghazali. So, he then quotes Al-Ghazali. So Al-Ghazali holds, quote, "The agent is not called a creative agent from the sole fact that it is a cause, but by its being a cause in a special way, namely that it causes through will and through choice." So it's exactly as I said. Al-Ghazali says precisely this. Averroes quotes him quite precisely, and structures his argument here, that is to destroy or undermine or show the incoherence of the philosophers on this particular issue. Al-Ghazali further argues that the necessary connection of God as agent with divine act, which, recall for Avicenna, is in virtue of the very being of God, bi-aniyatihi, is not a real act for Al-Ghazali, since it is inseparable from the agent. And Al-Ghazali insisted that we can separate, with regard to every act, then the act of the agent can be separated from the agent because the agent is willing it. So the act does not follow immediately upon the very being of the agent. We saw that in the Platiniana Arabica and in Avicenna, that given the existence of God, there immediately follows the existence of the first created thing, which is another intellect. In that sense, then, so immediately in the positing of the existence of God, then there was the positing of the act. And you'll recall the reasoning for this. God is an agent, and as agent, God will act. There's no reason for any pause. There's no insertion of another act of some kind, because that would introduce plurality into God. And so Avicenna says that God acts in virtue of his very being, immediately, without anything in between, and creates that first created thing, which is intellect. And both are eternal, according to the account of Avicenna. So, every act must involve a prior act of will, according to Al-Ghazali. And Averroes is here directly putting forward the notion that this is anthropomorphic. So, in his response, we want to take special note of how Averroes uses Aristotelian philosophy. He first lists the 4 Aristotelian causes, which obviously is telegraphing the notion that we're in the context of Aristotelian philosophical thinking. The agent cause, which we can also call the efficient cause or the moving cause, the matter, which has potentiality in it, the form, which is the actuality of the potentiality and dictates what a thing is, and the end, which is the goal or purpose of something. So then he gives the definition of agent for Averroes. And take note of the way he defines the notion of agent here. It is what causes some other thing to pass from potentiality to actuality and from non-existence to existence, sometimes by choice, sometimes by nature. So what is implicit in this notion that he presents here of the definition of agent? Well, it certainly is Aristotelian, as I indicated already. And so for Aristotle, something comes into existence or some activity takes place when some potentiality is actualized. So the potentiality for me to stand up or to walk is a potentiality that is present in me, and then something else prompts it to act. I choose to get up and get a cup of coffee, perhaps. And so I go from not existing as standing to existing as standing. And so there's a potentiality that has to be present. So for anything to come to pass, there must be a potentiality available to it. So there's some pre-existing potentiality. I can't go into it in great detail here, but this is Aristotle's notion of accidental change, which I just described, and then also substantial change. The possibility, or rather potentiality, for my dog to go out of existence is there, and when that happens, then the dog as a substance no longer exists. But there was the potency or potentiality there for the dog to go out of existence, just as there is potency to actuality for something to go from non-existence. My dog was born to existence, being born. So my dog was conceived and was born. And these sorts of activities sometimes occur by choice and sometimes by nature. My point here is that he's putting it all in the Aristotelian context. And any action or change will be the actuality of a potentiality. This implies that there is a pre-existing potentiality to any actualization. That's very important in his argument. So, for Al-Ghazali then, the agent can be separate from its object, and so God is separate from the world, and not the same thing as a natural cause. That's true for Al-Ghazali, it's also true for Averroes, but here he is stressing this notion from natural philosophy, where there is motion and change, and applying that Aristotelian principle to all actuality and God as well. We'll see what this means, but it means something very different from what this sort of thing meant with Avicenna. Remember, Avicenna stressed so much that with the first cause, the world comes into existence from nothing. Even if the world is eternal, it comes into existence from nothing and requires a first cause that is an efficient or agent cause, bringing things about in the world. I give you a little heads up with regard to this, that for Averroes, there is no such agent causality as that. That is, creation ex nihilo is not one of the teachings of Averroes. Creation has a different meaning, but we'll see more of that shortly. At Tehafut 152, he writes the following then, quote, "Nor is he an agent in the sense in which any empirical agent, either voluntary or involuntary, is. He is rather the agent of these causes, drawing forth the universe from non-existence to existence and conserving it. And such an act is a more perfect and glorious one than any performed by the empirical agent." Close quote. Notice the phraseology, drawing forth the universe from non-existence to existence and conserving it. So his notion of divine agency is that God draws things from potentiality to actuality, drawing it from non-existence to existence. Not absolute non-existence, but the non-existence in actuality. So there is going to be a pre-existing potentiality there. And God's role is to conserve the universe as well in this. So the various changing things here in the world are drawn by God into existence from non-existence. This is the Aristotelian notion of final causality. So take special note here that he is not talking about agent causality, although he uses the word agent. Agent causality is the causality that brings something into existence from nothing. There's not absolutely nothing in this case. So the matter and the potentiality of matter will be foundational for the whole understanding of creation according to Averroes. Go on then, quote, "None of these objections therefore touch them," says Averroes, "for they believe that God's act proceeds from him through knowledge, not through any necessity which calls for it, either in his essence or outside his essence, but through his grace and his bounty." Let's pause for a moment here. Notice the religious language. All right, so he's asserting that God has knowledge. He hasn't explained how knowledge is involved in God's creation in any detail here. And there's nothing that God needs. He asserts that as well. But he says this comes about through his grace and his bounty. Now those are religious terms that need to be reinterpreted in this context. So they're metaphors. For what? In the philosophical context, we would need to explain exactly what those mean. But our context here is mixed. It's a dialectical treatise, recall. And he's dealing with religious notions and the religious argumentation that's used against the philosophers by Al-Ghazali. So religious terminology is appropriate. But don't forget what we've already established in the methodology, that metaphorical terms and dialectical discussions are important, but underlying those must be an assertion as to what the real truth of the matter is. The truth may be different from the theological account or the dialectical account. He goes on, "He is necessarily endowed with will and choice in their highest form, since the insufficiency which is proper to the empirical willer does not pertain to him." No, what's going on here? What is God's knowledge? Well, in good Aristotelian fashion, as we'll see later on, his conception of God's knowledge is God himself. God is a self-knower, and God's knowledge is identical with God. And what does God know as the object of knowledge? Following the Aristotelian tradition, God knows himself as the proper object of knowledge. Precisely what we mean when we predicate knowledge of God, I want to leave to a little bit later. Let me go on to the second question I have here. What are choice and will when predicated of God? We already saw that the conceptual content of choice and will are the conceptual content of those terms as used here in the world are denied of God. So what is the meaning or the conceptual content of these terms when predicated of God? What choice does God have? He's already asserted that God does not choose between the good and the better. And also, what does will involve with regard to God? So these terms will be given special meaning in the philosophical contexts where they refer to God, because the way God is not the way things are in the empirical or perceptual world around us. So the immediate transference of these notions would give us the idea to God, transfer these notions to God, would give us the idea that God ponders, deliberates, and then makes choices, and that God has will with regard to these things and could will to do otherwise. Yet if, as we've already seen with Avicenna, God does not will not to create, that's not available to God as far as Avicenna is concerned. So these terms mean something very, very different when applied to God. And yet the point is that Al-Ghazali is insisting that they be used in an anthropomorphic fashion. Of course, this doesn't mean that the full account of how the philosophers understand choice, will, and divine knowledge is made clear here. And it doesn't have to be made clear here because this is a dialectical treatise. We'll look at these in detail next week when we consider the philosophical accounts in his commentary on the metaphysics. But for now, we want to stress here that in fact he can say such things as will and choice in their highest form belong to God, but he's already made it quite clear that the conceptual content of these is not known to us because we cannot say that this is analogous to or similar in meaning with these notions as used here in the world. So you need to think carefully about what function these have. Is their function philosophical here? And are they properly predicated of God? And do they have the same conceptual content as things in the world? Or is this part of the dialectical treatise on religious terminology as appropriate in religion and accepted by the tradition? So I'll leave that to ponder. God is the cause, according to Averroes, and at the Taffa 152, God is the cause of the composition of the world. Notice that, the notion of God is the composite cause of the composition of the world, and not the very being of the world in the same sense that we saw Avicenna. This is not ex nihilo creation. How does this happen? Well, he says, he then is the cause of the existence of composites, and necessarily he who is the cause of the existence of anything whatever is its agent. That's a definition. What does agent mean for Averroes? It means he who is the cause of the existence of anything. That is an agent. So if God is the cause of the existence of composites, and necessarily so, then God is an agent. But the conception of agent here is not that of efficient causality necessarily. He gives the indication that it seems like it's the same as Avicenna, but it's not. Averroes' conception here is that God acts through final causality. That is, all things yearn to have the fulfillment and completeness in being that God has. And so when he says, he then is the cause of the existence of composites, what he means is God's perfection draws things to unite into composites and into completeness, and God's drawing of all things into existence is the giving of existence, not efficient causality or agent causality in this case. We'll see more on this later. And I should also mention here then that necessary and possible existence, which we've seen in Avicenna, then, for Averroes, should be understood in terms of, quote, that which is really an agent. That is that which brings potency into act. What is he doing? He's implicitly setting aside the agent causality of Avicenna here and saying that the real agent, that which brings things from potency into act, is God acting as final cause, drawing all things to him. Aristotle used the metaphor of love in this case. That is, God draws all things to himself as if by love. The conceptual content of this is that God is the most perfect of all entities in being. All things in the world are drawn to perfection in being, and what draws them to perfection in being is God himself as that which pulls all things toward his ultimate perfection in being. All the things pulled toward him through final causality that he draws, not through efficient causality, but all things are trying to imitate and attain the fullness that they can of their own being within the limits of their own species. That's God's causality. All things try to be as perfect as possible in being. And so the very notion is present in the things themselves, and this is God's activity in things. But it's not an activity of an agent cause. It's the activity of a final cause. Where Al-Ghazali continues to insist that the inanimate does not act as an agent, Averroes responds with a strictly Aristotelian account of the nature of agency. And he says at 154, quote, his assertion that not every cause is called an agent is true, but his argument that the inanimate is not called an agent is false. For the denial that the inanimate exhibits acts excludes only the rational and voluntary act, not act absolutely. For we find that certain inanimate things have powers to actualize things like themselves. Fire, for example, fire, which changes anything warm and dry into another fire like itself, through converting it from what it has in potency into actuality. Again, notice the language here. The fire had the potency, had the natural potency within it, and that potency was actualized. So there's something pre-existing. So the agent always acts on something pre-existing in this case. And in the general philosophy of Averroes, then there's something pre-existing involved in this. So, in fine Aristotelian fashion, Averroes insists that act means the actualization of a potency. How is this relevant to God as agent? It means that God as agent acts by the actualization of a potency. So we saw indications of this in his discussion of the eternity of the world, that there was smoke or other things according to the Quran that God then had to separate, and he understands this to indicate then that there was something coexistent with God, not with the same perfection and being as God, but something coexistent there, and God acted on that. But wait, how can God act on that? God has to act in terms of final causality, the actualization of a potentiality, because God does not act as an efficient cause. So what is he doing? He's using religious language and the language of agency in a very, very different way, because God is not primarily an agent acting as efficient cause, but rather an indirect agent acting as the final cause of all, drawing all things to him. So that creative causality for Averroes, the creative causality which was in Avicenna, is not here in the same way. Rather, God draws all things from potentiality to actuality and does so eternally, and so God is the eternal cause of all things. Insofar as God causes action in other things, then in some secondary sense, God himself is the agent of all things. Page 54 continues as follows then. Therefore, fire cannot make a fire like itself in anything that has not the potency, or that is not in readiness to receive the actuality of fire. So for anything that comes to pass, there has to be a pre-existing potency. So for God's action to take place in the world, there has to be a pre-existing potency there. And God draws things to actuality by this final causality, not directly by a kind of efficient causality. Al-Ghazali accuses the philosophers of speaking metaphorically in asserting inanimate things have agency. But according to Averroes, Al-Ghazali holds that agency conceptually contains willing and choosing, and so denies this same. And he says, quote, if by agent or tendency or willing is meant the performance of an act of a willer, it is metaphor. But when by these expressions is meant that it actualizes another potency, it is really an agent in the full meaning of the word. Again, notice the definition of the term here then. An agent is what actualizes the potency of another thing. And so these notions are essential. But what's going on with Al-Ghazali, what Averroes is arguing here, is that Al-Ghazali is the one that's making use of metaphor, and not the philosophers in this case. In the course of his critique of Al-Ghazali, and in the course of his mention of Asherite denial of free will, Averroes adds some more remarks. Let me mention something here about this Asherite denial of human free will, however. The Asherites were occasionalists. They're early Islamic theologians, and they were occasionalists. I think I've touched on them briefly before. You might look up something on this in the Encyclopedia of Islam. The second or third edition would be better. Look up the Asherites. They were occasionalists. They thought that all power belonged to God alone, and there was no power or free will on the part of human beings. Now this is a philosophical theology that gets extremely complex, and we don't have time to get into all the details here, but his point is that the Asherites denied human free will and said that everything was controlled by God in some way. So in the course of his critique of this and his mention of this, he writes the following, quote, "How can we know that it is an accurate description of the real agent in the divine world to say that he acts through knowledge and will?" Close quote. So, while a critical response in context, this nevertheless puts the issue on the table for discussion and dissection. That is the question, what does it mean to say that God acts through knowledge and will, if these terms don't have the same meaning? We've already touched on this notion of knowledge in God, and the notion that for God, knowledge is required, knowledge is present in God, and pardon me, knowledge is present in God, but what is the conceptual content of that knowledge? And is it a knowledge of things other than himself? We already saw that God does not know things other than himself, and yet in some way God's knowledge is neither of particulars nor of universals, but God's knowledge is creative of things as well. So the notion of knowledge needs to be unpacked still, and we'll do a bit of that next week as well. And also, what's the conceptual content again of the notion of will when applied to God, if will is for the sake of choice? So he's raising these issues and raising the question of whether all of these various terms that are used here in the world are suitably applied to God. This is all the more clear at page 160, where he writes the following, quote, "The philosophers do not deny absolutely that God wills, for he is an agent through knowledge and from knowledge, and he performs the better of two contrary acts, although both are possible. They, the philosophers, only affirm that he does not will in the way that man wills." Let's unpack this pretty carefully. So, we've already seen that the notion of will, when applied to God, does not have the same conceptual content as it does in the world. Okay, so the philosophers do not deny absolutely that God wills. Indeed, Avicenna will say that God wills. We already saw in the Platiniana Arabica and also in the Liber de Causes that will was not part of the divine action. But Avicenna puts it in some way. Alright, so God is an agent through knowledge and from knowledge. What does it mean to say that God is an agent through knowledge and from knowledge? One might think that God thinks about things and has various ideas in his mind, and then through efficient causality or agent causality brings those things about in the world. No, that's not final causality. And that would be a kind of agency, and a kind of agency that is ex nihilo, that Averroes does not think is appropriate of God. So what does it mean to say that God acts through knowledge and from knowledge? We'll have to get into that in some detail later on. Perhaps next class, I think, is the best time, because next class we're going to focus on what is his actual teaching, his actual philosophical teaching, which undergirds his general teaching on the nature of divine knowledge. He goes on then, he performs the better of two contrary acts, although both are possible. Well, they may be both possible for God, but of course God necessarily performs the better of two contrary acts. So he's giving this sense here, in the surface of his words, he's giving the sense that God makes a choice between two contrary acts. But does he say that here? No, he does not say that. He says that God performs the better of two contrary acts. Well, in reality, God always performs the better act. But wait a minute, what does it mean to say that God performs, if God is only a final cause? my point in all of this is that we need to reinterpret this language, because this language is full of metaphor. And so when translated into the philosophical context, this will have a very, very different meaning. So, God does not will the way human beings will. All right, then what does it mean? What is the conceptual content of willing with regard to God? This we're yet to see. So what Averroes is doing here is making use of the religious terminology and religious ideas to make various affirmations without explaining to us the conceptual content of the terminology that he is using with regard to God. And that's key to his account. So he has a philosophical account underlying this dialectical discussion, but he does not make the philosophical account completely clear here. And he continues to use dialectical language. That is language which has certain assumptions in it, and language which is also religious in this context. But the meanings of the terms, he's already made clear, the meanings of the terms cannot be the same. Averroes' discussion of the first issue on agency, will, and choice comes to an end at page 161. We'll take up the second issue, the notion of act, after a short break, and I'll try to touch also upon the notions from in the readings in the Kashf al-Manahij, the explanation of the sorts of argumentation in religious discussions. So we'll begin at Taf at 162 when we return after the short break.